Chapter 14. In Sickness and in Health. "Get back into bed, Tony," said Lesley in sleepy exasperation. "I thought I heard something round the back," I whispered predictably. "It was probably a cat again, or you're friggin' snoring," replied my love, as she turned her back on me to return to her sleep. "There's never anybody there." I was standing in my Nick Cayman boxer shorts, checking out the possible dangers lurking down below at the back of the house. Maybe Lesley was right. Not about my snoring, of course, but it was possible that the noise was nothing but a cat fight. I was exhausted by this nightly security check. A full night's sleep was a rare luxury. Lesley was correct. For a year now, there had only been one attempt to breach the security of the house, and even then, we were almost certainly an intended escape route rather than the prospective victims of a sectarian attack. I had invested in even more extra locks for all the doors and windows, although my DIY skills were such that they offered little effective protection. I seemed more scared than my wife, and it wasn't supposed to be that way round. Although she had lived in a Republican area all of her life, and I was still getting used to it. I had only been threatened a few times since I started working in the salt shaker, but nothing serious. The worst was a solvent abuser threatened to smash in my specky face because I had banned him from the youth club for sniffing a furniture polish aerosol in the toilets, which I warned was not only damaging his health, but also his relationship with God and the ozone layer. The combination of long working hours and lack of sleep was once again having an impact on my health. I was constantly recovering from the flu or a cold, and Lesley had started to join in the extended snuffling. One morning, Lesley awoke with a heavy cold and decided to stay in bed for a rest. "I'll see you at lunchtime," I called as I dashed downstairs. "It's the prayers for healing this morning." Then Lesley developed eczema on her hands, and even I realised that it must be stress-related. We needed to take action to look after ourselves, otherwise we would be of no use to the people we were trying to help. We hadn't taken a proper holiday since our honeymoon, just a few weekends in Balaki and a bank holiday Monday in the rain in Port Stewart. So we decided that a fortnight in the sun was exactly what we needed. When I told the members of the Tuesday night youth club we were going abroad on holiday, the news elicited a range of responses. "Aye, you and Big Lesley deserve a wee break," said Soup. "Yousins must be fucking loaded," exclaimed Paddy. In reality, we weren't earning enough money for a fortnight in Benidorm, but I managed to find us a late deal to Greece in the window of the Co-op travel shop. Lesley couldn't understand why the holiday was so cheap, but I assured her that I had bagged us an outstanding Aegean bargain. According to my atlas and my understanding of the prevailing winds in the past year, Halkidiki was far enough south in Greece to be safe from the nuclear fallout from Chernobyl. We booked 2 whole weeks off work and arranged cover at our youth clubs and volunteers who would take the youth club keys to check for intruders during a break-in, because the police would assume any reported break-in was a trap to kill them. Big Dave agreed to both fish and dog sit for us and to keep an eye on the house, because half the youth of North and West Belfast were aware that it would be temptingly empty. The holiday was a welcome break from work, but it rained the whole time. The apartments, which were located 3 miles from the nearest shop, were still under construction, and we ran out of money after 10 days. While the builders drilled outside and the thunder roared overhead, Lesley read a few novels and copies of Hello, and I read the biography of Martin Luther King that Big Dave had recommended. I was more inspired than ever by this courageous peace builder who believed that love was stronger than hate and that light was more powerful than darkness. The biography was a huge hardback book that had weighed down our suitcase considerably, but the terrible weather provided an opportunity to study the life of a hero of Christian pacifism at a time when I was living and working in the midst of a senseless spiral of tit-for-tat violence. Here was a man of faith who stood firmly by non-violent principles as a way of challenging discrimination and securing civil rights. Where is the Northern Irish Martin Luther King? I wondered. I was disappointed when I read about Luther King's marital infidelity and the pain this caused his wife. But then I realised that my hero was not a faultless man. Every day I was absorbed and nourished by powerful words. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. This man was incredible, I cried as I turned the pages describing his turning the other cheek under great provocation. I cried when I read the chapter about his assassination. This book is brilliant, I kept saying to Lesley during the many hours I spent reading within the confines of our sparsely furnished room in our unfinished apartment block. Lesley was a bit quiet. When we arrived back in Belfast, we were shocked to discover that there had been a break-in at the house. Dave had forgotten his keys one day and had been forced to break a window to get in to comfort a fretting Farah. It was ironic that after all of my months of worrying about a possible forced entry by a sectarian hood, the only incident of breaking and entering involved a Mennonite pacifist from Indiana. We didn't have any photos of our Greek holiday. When we returned home, we discovered that the film in Lesley's camera had not been properly inserted. We rowed about whose fault it was, and neither of us spoke a word through a whole Sunday afternoon omnibus edition of EastEnders. Eventually, we kissed and made up, in spite of the fact that all of the lovely photos of the apartments being built, the orange trees on the dusty road outside the building site, and the beauty of Mount Athos peeking through the rain clouds were lost forever. Later that month, I brought my own camera to the Saltshaker Pensioners Club to take a few pictures of the senior citizens for the newsletter. I had a few exposures remaining in an old roll of film, which included a few photographs of my father's final day out, an Easter Monday trip to Ballycastle the previous year. I was going to take the final few shots, post the film off to be developed, and then find an appropriate moment to give my mother the final photos of my father, to keep as a happy memory. I set the camera down on one of the tables to help several elderly ladies down the step at the front door, but when I returned, my camera was gone. It had obviously been stolen, but I optimistically created a poster asking for the missing camera to be returned, explaining that there were photos of great sentimental value on the film. Of course, I never saw the camera again, and the final photographs of my father were lost forever. I was getting sick and tired of all of this. In fact, I was sick and tired a lot of the time. Sometimes Farah hid in her bed to get away from the sounds of petrol bombs, and even Big Dave got depressed when one of the young people he had been making real progress with let him down. No one turned up for the cross-community meetings. I couldn't tell whether it was forbidden by the paramilitaries or just so boring as to attract zero interest. During the last youth club trip to Greenhill YMCA in the Mourne Mountains, I had to clean up vomit from all over the bunk beds due to the abuse of several smuggled bottles of vodka. It seemed that no one was interested in God or peace or love. Maybe my head was indeed in cloud cuckoo land after all. Even our first family gathering in the house was a sad occasion. Lesley and I provided the tea and sandwiches after my father's inquest at the Crumlin Road courthouse, because we lived just around the corner. It was like a rerun of the funeral, but with greater emphasis on the method and details of the suicide. This was the last thing my mother needed. This process, in full public view, in the grand surroundings of the courthouse, in front of an authoritarian-looking judge, was a good top-up for her feelings of depression and loss, and reminded her just how traumatic the events of the previous year had been. I visited my mother as often as possible to see how she was coping. She was attending a day centre for people suffering from depression, and was receiving counselling at a home by Cruise, the bereavement charity. All of this helped, but it couldn't bring my father back. A few days later, Lesley arrived home from a particularly difficult day at work, just as I was leaving to visit my mother. "I'm just popping up to see how Mum is doing. I'll be back soon," I said as we passed at the front door. We were like ships in the night. It was Remembrance Sunday, and I had skipped church because I had become increasingly uncomfortable with the connection between church and state at these services. For as long as I could remember, the Remembrance Day service was the most well-attended church service of the year in Ballygomartin Presbyterian Church. At Easter, there were the same few people in the congregation. At Christmas, the back rows filled up. But on Remembrance Day, there weren't enough seats for everyone. Remembering our war dead attracted more Ulster Protestants than the birth, death, or resurrection of the Son of God. This confirmed to me that my people, who always talked about being for God and Ulster, were ultimately always much more for Ulster than for God. Big Dave explained to me why Mennonites did not have Remembrance Day services and how they'd gone to prison as conscientious objectors for refusing to fight in wars. Every year at the Remembrance service, I would wear my poppy and stand during the last post and a minute's silence, remembering all the lives that had been wasted in all of the wars in this sad world. I asked God to take away our violent human nature and prayed for an end to wars and for peace in my land. However, I was certain that God was not British and that we were not completely justified in the taking of every life on behalf of our state in the history of the world. For months now I had heard about and experienced some of the more shameful actions of the British Army on the streets of my city, and I felt uncomfortable with Union flags and with singing God Save the Queen during the church service. I wondered if Catholics hung Irish tricolours and sang the soldier song in chapels at Easter, but I was pretty sure they didn't, or I would have heard all about it. As far as I could understand from my reading of history, the Christian Church had always been at its most brutal, corrupt and anti-Christ when it had been appropriated by the nationalism, politics and power of any country. So I was enjoying a rare heathen lie-in that Sunday morning when there was a news flash on downtown radio. News was coming in of a terrible bomb attack at the Remembrance Sunday service at the Cenotaph in Enniskillen. There were reports of many people killed and injured. I heard interviews about people bleeding, buried and dying on a street in Enniskillen at a religious service on a Sunday morning. I felt physically sick. This feeling of being so sickened that I could feel it in my guts was becoming more and more familiar to me. I phoned Dave Moser and advised him not to walk along the streets alone that night in case of any random drive-by retaliatory sectarian attacks, and sadly, my prediction of such attacks proved to be justified. I already knew all of the well-worn justifications for this barbarity that I would have to listen to in the days ahead. My pleas for pacifism would be just pissing in the wind. However, in the midst of the pain and suffering in the days following the atrocity, the justifications and condemnations, an unlikely hero emerged. In the history of Northern Ireland, Gordon Wilson of Enniskillen is one of very few people remembered as a man of Christian faith who spoke words of forgiveness in the midst of violence and hatred. The BBC interviewed Gordon Wilson and he spoke with great clarity and dignity about the loss of his beloved daughter, Mary, who held his hand and told her father she loved him before she died underneath the rubble. When speaking about the killers of his daughter, he said, "I bear no ill will, I bear no grudge. Dirty sort of talk is not going to bring her back to life." Gordon Wilson was on every news bulletin around the world for days. This extraordinary man, who had suffered inconceivable loss, showed the world not anger, bitterness and intransigence, but love, peace and forgiveness. He gained respect across the world. The only voices I heard raised against Gordon Wilson were those of the nastiest unionist politicians who wanted a carpet bombing of South Armagh and West Belfast to wipe out the IRA and presumably everyone else living in those communities. In the youth club, the justifications of the bombing were more muted than usual. Some of the young people said it was a mistake, and a few said quietly that it was wrong. No one criticised Gordon Wilson, although I did have a few challenging exchanges. "It's war," said Jerry predictably. 2,000 years of British oppression, added Paddy. "Do you honestly think that killing more people like Mary Wilson is going to bring you a united Ireland?" I asked. "It was a British army target," said Jerry. "But she wasn't a British soldier," I replied. There was silence. And what would happen if you forgave the Brits the way Gordon Wilson is prepared to forgive the IRA? "Never," said Jerry. "Never?" I asked. "Never," he repeated. "Now you're starting to sound like Ian Paisley," I replied. "What the fuck do you know about the suffering of the people round here anyway?" he said. "Sure, you're only here to preach at us." Now Jerry was getting genuinely angry. I knew it was better to stop the conversation at this point. In spite of all the tension, violence and intimidation, we had succeeded in establishing a small cross-community oasis in the heart of Republican North Belfast. We had Protestants and Catholics working together on the ACE scheme and across the peace line. We even had Darren and Roberta, who were from Loyalist areas, working in the cafe, and everyone got along really well most of the time, even when the toasties were burnt. However, in the days following the Enniskillen bombing, I seriously wondered if I was wasting my time. I talked a lot to Dave, and together we supported each other to keep going in spite of our growing sense of despair. Not long after the bombing, a group of the lads from the youth club arrived at my house, and I invited them in for a cup of tea. It seemed like a good opportunity to try to be a positive influence, but I noticed Lesley flinch when the group came into the living room. The group stayed for a couple of hours, chatting, slagging and discussing music, religion and politics in a friendly manner. It was one of those occasions when I thought I might not be wasting my time after all. When the group eventually departed, I noticed Lesley wasn't happy. "What's wrong?" I inquired. "I wanted a night off," she said. "I've been working with young people every night this week too, and I need a break for one night in my own house." "But is this not what we're here for?" I said. "We had a really good chat with the lads tonight, and I think it shows we're making a difference in their lives. They really need someone to listen to them, someone who cares about their lives." "But what about me?" said Lesley. "What do you mean? What about me?" "But you're okay, aren't you?" "Of course I'm okay. Living here on the peace line, you up and out of bed every night, getting used to being married and looking after you every bloody day and working long hours in my own job, which is just as important as yours, by the way." "What about me?" she repeated. "You're more interested in saving the world and looking after those wee lads and your mother and any stranger that walks through the door of that salt shaker. But what about me? Who's interested in looking after me?" "Me, of course," I said. "Well, you wouldn't think it." Lesley began to cry, and I felt terrible. She always listened and took care of me. This was our first proper married row that was not about something trivial like my bad driving or Lesley spending too much on nice clothes. Our raised voices sent Farah scurrying to her bed. I felt guilty. Here I was trying to bring peace to Belfast and failing miserably, and in the process causing arguments with my own wife in my own home. Once I stopped being defensive and we had both calmed down, we agreed to spend more time together, just the two of us. We planned to return to the Country House Hotel in Kells for one night for our wedding anniversary, and put into practice everything we had learnt since our bedroom fumbling in the same spot a year earlier. We agreed to have Lesley and Tony nights, when no one else would be allowed to interrupt us, not even the Reverend Taylor. We couldn't afford to go out much, but we went to the cinema and to Kentucky Fried Chicken in Glengormley, where we regularly shared a bargain bucket in the car park. On our days off, we returned to Port Stewart, where we had first fallen in love, and we went for long romantic walks along the beautiful beach. Margaret Wilkinson let us stay in her flat in Castle Rock for a quiet weekend away from the peace line. Back in Belfast at weekends, we treated ourselves to a night in front of the television, laughing at Cheers on Channel 4, with a Chinese takeaway from a hot food bar on the Cliftonville Road that did lovely sweet and sour pork.